Hey, that's very nice of everyone. Thank you. Yes, our 14th YouTube lecture. We're going to finish up period 8 and put a little bit of period 9 on here. We're going to talk a little bit now about the conservative revolution. And hopefully this will be a short one. We'll see. I just want to get right into the key concepts here. All right, so 8.2, Roman numeral 3, letter C. So we see the 1960s. If you remember in class, this is the height of the Great Society, the height of liberalism under Lyndon Johnson. There's also a massive counterculture revolution that takes place because of the Vietnam War. And all these things are kind of colliding together. This is what is going to help bring about this conservative challenge now. And they challenge three different things here. They challenge the various liberal laws that are coming out of Washington under especially Johnson, and they challenge the court decisions of the Warren Court, a very liberal court, and what they perceive to be a moral and cultural decline. Again, looking at the counterculture revolution, the sexual revolution, and what they just felt was just a decay of what they felt was strong American values. They also very much want to limit the role of the federal government. You get the rise of what's known as the new right. We talked about in class the new left. Here we get a more ultra-conservative view, more so than the moderate Republicans under Dwight Eisenhower and Nelson Rockefeller. Phyllis Schlafly, a Republican leader, she wrote many books, and one of her famous books is a book called A Choice Not an Echo, where she denounced what she felt were moderate or even liberal Republicans, or what she called Rockefeller Republicans. Nelson Rockefeller is in New York at this time period. And he was, those Republicans were more moderate in thinking, and at times perhaps even a little liberal. They had come out of the FDR era of the New Deal. And she was now looking for, as were other Republican leaders, a more strong to the right center of the Republican Party and more conservatism. One of the big things that they began to really preach was a renewed commitment to states' rights. Yeah, think about that. States' rights back pre-Civil War kind of thought. This really harkens back to almost more of a Jeffersonian idea of government. Limited government, smaller government, states having more say in how the country should be run. Barry Goldwater's election of his campaign, I should say, of 1964 emphasized states' rights. He's going to appeal to a lot of Southern Democrats. One of the things he did is he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He felt this was unconstitutional. And again, these ultra-conservatives are now going to challenge the role of the federal government. They want to see a smaller federal government. And it's interesting, as we know, Barry Goldwater will lose this election. One of the reasons he begins to emphasize too much of a war in Vietnam. But it also led to the beginning of the political career of an actor by the name of Ronald Reagan. At this time period, he will jump onto the conservative bandwagon. He'll give a speech. It's not the nominating speech for Barry Goldwater, but it is a speech in favor of Barry Goldwater's presidency, A Time for Choosing. And it's interesting, Reagan will hearken back to the Founding Fathers, as Reagan often will do. He'll talk about the Founding Fathers not wanting to use the government to control economics, because in his mind, he felt the Founding Fathers thought to control the economy would mean to control people. And thereby they didn't do that. So one of the things too about this new right, this new conservative push, was more of an idea of laissez-faire economics, more of an idea of free markets and that sort of stuff, and less government control, less government spending on special programs and things like that. And it began here in the 64 election. Of course, they will lose. But Ronald Reagan will become governor of California in 66. So this conservative revolution is starting to take place. Let's move over to another concept. We see by the 1970s, The conservative revolution is growing as they begin to clash more and more with liberals over social and cultural issues. Again, they're re-emphasizing here the power of the federal government. They would like to limit that over issues of race. Conservatives feel more that the government should not get involved in these things, that individuals should work on their own in order to improve race relations. And again, they preach the idea of greater individual rights and even the idea of states' rights. One of the things that they began to fight over is the Equal Rights Amendment. This was an amendment specifically aimed in the beginning to help women in America, to bring about an equality between men and women, making no distinction between men and women in this country when it comes to everything. A lot of states begin to vote for this amendment. Here's our individual again, Phyllis Schlafly. She is anti-ERA. Now you might wonder, why would a woman not want equal rights? Well, for other women. She has a lot of various reasons, and one of the things she argues about is the subject of the draft. If you have an equal rights amendment, currently women are not subject to the draft, and she would argue that now, with an equal rights, with men and women being equal in all things, women would become subject to the draft. And even women who are for the ERA, leaders of the NOW movement, the National Organization of Women, they themselves would acknowledge this is true, that women would have an equal standing to the draft and become subject to the draft. For women like Schlafly, they would argue that this would hurt the traditional role of women in the home as homemaker. She also argued that the newer generation of women were disregarding the older middle class generation of women who are being denied things like Social Security rights, alimony if they got divorced later on in life. And this begins to work. This conservative movement against the ERA movement, and states that have originally ratify it will eventually start revoting and take it back. And eventually the ERA, they'll try again in the 80s, and this conservative movement will work again against it, and Equal Rights Amendment will never be passed. So this is a victory for the conservative and the conservative revolution. Another huge part of this growing conservative movement is this massive evangelical Christian movement that happens right around the mid-70s into the 1980s. As our concept tells us, they become very organized and they become very, very political and social active. Sometimes we might refer to this as a fourth great awakening. The group of them began to call themselves the moral majority, and they began to seek out candidates for every office: local mayor, representatives of a state governor, representatives to Congress, and even President of the United States, who would be interested in keeping certain laws that they particularly were interested in, more based on a moral compass than on a secular, non-religious idea. They were very anti-liberalism, very, very devout conservatives. Jerry Falwell is one of the biggest leaders of this movement at the time period. Also, a lot of televangelists. They used television to get their message across. They had a huge following. And this is one of the sectors of the conservative revolution that is going to actually help Ronald Reagan become president of the United States. Yes, this Christian coalition, as it were, first time really in America. We can go back to the Second Great Awakening, and we can see where the Christians of that time period became very socially active. A lot of programs began because of them, abolition being one. But this one became extremely political and got very involved in politics. And eventually, some of these religious leaders themselves will become candidates for President of the United States. Oh, here we go with the vortex. I always like the vortex. Now, our key concept in 9. Very interesting. Again, conservative revolution will eventually win because Ronald Reagan will become president in the 1980s, and we'll talk about Reagan specifically in the classroom. Again, they begin to argue that liberal programs are counterproductive in fighting poverty. and in stimulating growth. In the 1970s, you saw a huge stagflation happen in America. Prices and wages in America aren't going up, but prices are. It's creating inflation. A lot of unemployment starts to happen because of this. And conservatives argue that the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, the New Deal programs under FDR that are still with us by the 1970s, these things have hurt the economy, and they do not allow for economic growth. Keynesian economics, for instance, they also begin to argue against Keynesian economics, which is where the government is massively involved in the economy. They also want to remove a lot of the programs that were developed at this time period. Here in 9.1, we have key concept 9.1, Roman numeral 1b and C. And C, economics plays a huge part of this. A free trade, reforming the United States financial system. Conservatives believe in free markets and a whole new economy. Not economy, that's the wrong word. An economist is going to come along with a whole new type of economic thinking. It's called monetarist theory. A lot of this comes out of Chicago. You have the great Chicago School of Economics, and Milton Friedman, one of America's most famous economists of all time, develops this theory known as monetarist theory. Now, hopefully next year as seniors in your economics class, perhaps you'll study this more, especially if you take AP Micro. And forgive me, I'm going to make this very simple. I'm not going to go very deep into monetarist theory. Basically, though, it takes Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand theory, which is capitalism, that markets should be open. There should be an idea between a producer and a consumer, and they themselves should dictate what an economy is. So that's laissez-faire, all right? The consumer, the producer make choices, not the government. A free market, what we call the invisible hand. But there's also a part of this that talks about how do you still control an economy? Well, you do so by controlling interest rates. If you bring interest rates up, if you lower interest rates. The monetarist theory begins to become part of the Federal Reserve Bank, which, if you don't know, you should know, is one of the most powerful entities in America. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve is one of the most powerful positions in this country because it gets to decide what interest rates will be. Will they go up? Will they go down? As you begin to change interest rates, you begin to change people's buying power. Can they get loans to get homes? Can they get loans to get cars? And these sorts of things. You look at construction of homes in the country. Interest rates have a lot to do with this. As the Federal Reserve becomes more and more tilted towards this monetarist theory of controlling interest rates, we also get a huge push towards freer and freer markets. This country is still basically Keynesian, but there is a little bit now of the monetarist theory that has come in. So again, the conservatives win quite a bit, late 70s throughout the early 80s, with Reagan presidency, especially his 8 years. And then eventually we get into the 90s, and we'll talk a little bit about the new Democrat that emerges under Clinton. And that's basically it. I just wanted to go over these few little points here about the conservative revolution. And we'll see each other later. I'll be posting later on the video logs for these on Edmodo. All right. Have a good evening, a good weekend, a good day, whenever it is you're watching this. All right, everybody. Awesome. So you guys thoroughly enjoyed this, right?
It needs to be about 20% cooler.
All right, well, 20% I can deal with. All right, bye-bye, everybody.